Welcome everybody. We're gonna give it 30-ish seconds, and then we're gonna dive right in. You can turn on your videos, you can turn off your videos, you can do whatever you want. It's all it's all up to you. Sweet. Let's go ahead and get started, as this is probably going to be the most important / best 30 minutes of your day, week, month, year, life. Excited to be here talking about BCG and the K-spot, the big mystery of all consulting interviews. We were just talking about early on that, yeah, it's one of those things where there's a lot of information online about all the other aspects of interviews, and then things like the K-spot and the other tests are a little bit more of a black box. So today we're going to dive in and talk a little bit more, and hopefully unveil some of those mysteries, give you some tips, leave some time at the end for questions. We do not have a ton of time together today, so I am going to be talking really quick, hopefully so we can leave time at the end for more targeted questions. But this is what it looks like. We'll spend as little time as possible at the beginning with an intro, letting you guys know who I am, my background, and why you should at least half listen to what I have to say. Then we'll dive into the logistics of the online test, the different types of questions you might face, dive into some very high level tips, things that I think might be helpful for you to know and to think about as you are navigating this test. And then again, we're hoping to have a solid 10 minutes at the end for questions, so you guys can ask more specific things. Let's dive in. I'm David. I'm originally from Salt Lake City, Utah. As Erica was making fun of me before this call, I have worked at a lot of different consulting firms. PwC and Cicero is a boutique firm here in Salt Lake. I spent 2 years out of undergrad at LEK doing a lot of private equity work. Went to business school, just graduated from Kellogg, which is a wonderful, wonderful place. And I'm now returning to BCG in the next few months. So needless to say, I have done my fair share of consulting recruiting as a candidate, both as an undergrad and as an MBA. I was also involved in recruiting on the other side, doing interviews at LEK and at other places, getting their perspective from the other side of the table. So yes, I've again spent my fair share of time doing case interview stuff, and I hope that we can learn together today. So diving into the test logistics, the most important thing is, this is an online case. Casey is the name of the chat bot that you'll be interacting with, a wonderfully named counterpart to be talking to. It will feel different than other cases you've done. It is an interviewer-led case, meaning they will be asking you questions that you will be responding to, and it's pretty predetermined, kind of the path that you will go down. It's not perfectly linear. There are different ways you can go depending on how well you structure the beginning, but at the end of the day, it is a fairly linear case, and it is completely interviewer-led, without a lot of flexibility, because that is one key difference from this and the other types of cases, is that you can't interact with your interviewer. There's not a lot of flexibility to be asking clarifying and follow-up questions. They try to make the things as clear as possible, so there's as little ambiguity as possible, but just know that going in. It is a pretty quick time limit. You've got 25 to 30 minutes to complete 7 to 10 questions. So for all you math whizzes out there, that's between 1 to 3 minutes per question. Some of those questions may have multiple parts, some not. When it comes to those question types, there's lots of different ways it can come. As you see in the kind of screenshot from the old BCG online case, it can be something just like a math multiple choice question, where you're given a chart or specific data and you're being asked to just calculate the answer and give the correct answer. Sometimes it's short response, particularly in the early phases of the case. Just like in a normal case interview, you'll get to the part where you're building your initial framework or your initial approach to the question. And so often early on in the case, there will be a free response kind of area for you to answer. The question will be something like, what are the key considerations when answering this question? Basically asking you to build out a structure. What are the kind of key high level buckets? I will say it's important because of the time limit and because of, yeah, just the fact that it's online and you're not like talking to an interviewer, like being concise is important here. You're not going to be writing out your top level buckets and your second level buckets and kind of, writing out paragraphs. Typically for a short response, you want to be somewhere in the ballpark of like 2 to 3 to maybe 4 sentences, but like pretty brief. The more concise you can be, the better off you'll be and the more time you'll have for other parts of the case. So yeah, shortish time limit, different question types. Again, some of them are, what do you think are the key considerations? Some of them are more targeted, asking about specific data or specific aspects of the case. Some of it is math. And then the last question is a 1-minute video recommendation. So just like you'll do in a normal case, you're going to take a minute to synthesize everything that you've done. In that 1 minute, just like in a real case, again, you kind of want to, I tend to think about that in 3 20-second sections. First, a 20-second summary of your recommendation. Don't spend a ton of time like rehashing everything that you did and talking about all the steps you take. Just take 20 seconds to give your recommendation, 20 seconds on risks, 20 seconds on next steps. Is typically the rubric that I try to follow, again, in normal cases and in this case. But in this case, it's extra important because it is a 1-minute hard stop. If you're at 102, those last 2 seconds are going to get cut off. So really being concise. And I think the easiest place to trim is right at the beginning. Again, don't spend a ton of time saying, here's all the math I did. Here was my original framework. Just dive into the recommendation. And that's a really easy way to be concise. Then you can still do your risks and your next steps to be a kind of full, thorough recommendation. As far as tips go, some of these I brought up, but I want to touch on each of these quickly because I think they're all important. The top left one is pretty straightforward. I think a lot of people get overly stressed about this part of the process because it is a little bit different. You've prepped, you've done your 20 or 30 or 40 cases, and they've all been really similar. It's you and a human interviewer that you can interact with, that you can ask questions to, and you've gotten into that groove. And this is a little bit different. Again, you're not going to be able to ask those questions, and it just feels a little bit different. And that's the bad news. But again, I think people overly stress about that. And the important thing is to remember all of the existing case prep you've done, from learning how to structure to doing good case math to being structured in your brainstorming and being creative throughout and driving the case. Like all of those skills that you've practiced are still perfectly relevant here. And that's the important thing. I think, again, it's more similar than it is different. The scaffolding and the like logistics part of it do feel a little bit different, but everything you've practiced is still very relevant. And so like be confident in that rather than fearful in the unknown, because that's the important thing. Second, be concise. I mentioned this about kind of the video recommendation at the end because you will get cut off. I think it's also important in all of the free response written communication pieces. Again, you don't have a ton of time, and it's often easier to write 2 paragraphs about your framework than it is to write 2 sentences. So that is something you can practice or think about, just like, how can I communicate whatever this is in the fewest amount of words and really, really be concise. Chart math. Again, this is something like when you get your math, it's often going to come in the chart form because you're interacting with it on a computer screen. They're going to give you that data visually. A lot of people, I wouldn't say they use as a crutch their interviewer that they're working with when they're going through real cases. But again, that's one piece that is not going to be there. If you have questions about the chart or the way that the chart is structured or whatever, you're not going to be able to ask those questions. So if you are not feeling super confident about charts or the different types of data you could be presented, that's one place you can spend a little bit of extra practice time before this case to get prepared. Just being sure you really understand all of the basic types of charts, whether that's bar charts or mechos or bubble charts or kind of the more common ones. Next, staying organized. I think a common mistake people make on this case is because it's online, they don't pull out their pen and paper and kind of do things the way they normally do. In general, I think it's still good practice to have out a piece of paper. You're not going to spend, again, a full 2 minutes writing out a full issue tree or framework at the beginning, but I do think it's valuable to kind of have the things that are familiar to a normal case with you, go through those similar processes. And when you get to questions 6 and 7 and you're trying to remember back to question 2 and whatever, you want to have your paper there just to make sure that you're staying organized. Next, fifth, pacing yourself. Again, we have 25 to 30 minutes, 7 to 8 questions. It can go quick. I do think, with that said, people tend to err on the side of going too quick and rushing rather than like taking their time. I think more people make mistakes going too fast than they do like being too slow and running out of time. You all know yourselves, you know your paces, like, so just think about that and calibrate. But again, in general, most people feel more rushed than they need to. So using a timer, having a stopwatch or something next to you, practicing with something to measure, how long is it taking me to clear this chart? Whenever you're doing your next practice with charts, like, hey, yeah, how long did it take me to clear that chart and do the math, whatever, like start to get a sense for how quick you are and then adjust from there. But having a timer visible, whether that's on your screen or using your phone or whatever, like totally fine. And you can use your phone, you can use a calculator, like all technology is fine. Like don't Google stuff, but having a calculator technology is fine. So that's another important tip I'd say is like, this is a little bit different. So figure out what technology you want to use. Do you want to have a stopwatch? Use your phone as a stopwatch. Do you want to have a separate calculator? Like figure all of that out and practice that. Don't be doing that the first time as you go through this case. This is number 6. Like I'm guessing out of the 150 of you here, like most of you have done this. But if not, like one of the most important things you can do is spend half an hour on YouTube watching one person go through one of these just to see the pace and the feel and get a feel for what the screen looks like, and taking out as much of that unfamiliarity as you can. There's lots of good examples of people going through sample cases where you can see what it's like to interact with the chatbot, the types of questions you're getting, what the pace feels like, etc. So definitely recommend doing that. I talked about using a calculator. 8th, think about what they're testing for. Over here on the right, we have kind of the rubric, the things that they care about, things like rigor and synthesis and business judgment and structuring. Like all of those things are similar and the same as they're thinking about for normal cases. So in the back of your mind, again, whether you're doing this case or a normal case, like whenever you're answering a part of the question, have that in the back of your mind. How can I show structure? How can I be really concise and synthesize, do the so what, all of that stuff. Particular here, the structuring is going to come in that short answer about your issue tree up at the beginning. Things like synthesis are probably going to spike more at the end in the video, but these are the things that they're looking for. So as much as you can, try to be concise, synthesize well, drive the case like you always do, and try to bring structure to every piece of the case that you can. Yeah, and then finally 9. This is like the advice you always hear that's like good but maybe dumb, like don't overly stress, right? It's like, oh, it's the easiest thing in the world. Like, don't worry about it. Much easier said than done. But I do think it's a worthwhile reminder to think, while this is an important part of the picture, it's one of many. You have your resume, you have your work experience, you have all of the networking that you've done with your firm, with the firm in whichever office you're looking to. And yeah, this is one part of the whole. A lot of people at Kellogg that took this in our cycle felt like they had bombed this case, partially because, again, this feels different than every other case you've done, right? You've done 30 or 40 cases one-on-one with another human being. You're going to do this case. It's going to feel different. And like out of default, even if you do fine on it, it's going to feel like, that didn't feel quite as clean or as wonderful as my normal cases do. But that's how most people feel. And like almost everyone that felt that way still went on to like move on to the next round. So again, this is important, and but it's one of many things, and it's probably going to feel like you didn't do that great on it, but don't over index on that and let it get to you. Yeah, sick. I did that in 15 minutes. I talked really fast. We can move to questions. I think best way is just to raise hands and you can come off mute. We can do a few that way.
David, I see one question in the chat about if it's used for all candidates, regardless of position or background, like MBA or experienced hires.
Yeah, good question. It's a little bit of a black box. I would not say it's not 100% for sure. I hesitate to say more, not because I think sometimes people read it too much into it, where it's like, oh, well, if not everyone's getting it, if I'm getting it, does that mean that they think my application is worse or whatever? Like, sometimes it varies by office, sometimes it just varies by level, but I'd say it's more common than not. But it's certainly not like a negative thing to get this. Part of the reason they did this was to expand reach and to give opportunities to more people. So historically, these BCG and other firms just recruited from very specific schools, and if you weren't going to one of those schools, it was very hard to break in. But this is a way to kind of democratize the experience, and it gives them the opportunity to interview even more people. But yeah, to answer the question directly, it's not everybody. It's more common than not. Like, you can expect it. If you don't end up doing it, then like, happy surprise. But I would expect to do it. And I wouldn't read too much into it, whether you do or you don't. All right. I can go through these questions on the chat. I see Sophia asked, gave the chatbot interview a while back, didn't receive a response regarding the outcome, but I felt like I did a terrible job. How does the outcome look like, and where can I practice? Cases seem more tough than normal interviews. Yeah. So like I said at the end of the tips thing, like, most people, that is how it feels, right? It's like, it just feels different. Just if you think back to like the first case or two that you did, like, most people feel like they bombed it, and most people do bomb it because it's just like a new, different experience. And so there is some of that. Again, most of the skills being tested, you're much better at than you were back when you were doing your first case or two. And so you aren't bombing it nearly as bad as you did back then, but it is just going to feel different. Even if you do like an adequate job. Again, most people that ended up getting interviews and jobs from my cohort at Kellogg, like, did not feel great about their performance on it for that exact reason. So yeah. You can't read too much into the outcome. Again, it's part of the whole, like, if you feel like you did terrible on it and you don't get the interview, like, it could have been other parts. It could have been, how tough the cycle is. It could be that maybe you didn't network enough, or there were not as many spots in the office you applied to, or one of a million things. So I wouldn't overread into it. But yeah, in general, I think, Sophia, your point about them feeling a little bit more tough than normal interviews is pretty common consensus. Not because I think they're actually like case wise, that like, if you were given the exact case that the case bot gave you in a normal setting, I don't think it would feel any harder or easier than any normal case. It's just the fact that you're a little bit more solo, you're a little bit more time pressured, makes it feel a little bit tougher and different. Jason asks, so does BCG have the case bot and in-person case interviews? Yes. Again, varies a little bit by level and office, kind of what the sequencing looks like. Sometimes it's the case bot is your first round, and then you move on to in-person. A lot of times it'll kind of be your first round will compose of one in-person or one live interview and one KC interview. It just depends a little bit. But yeah, it's always a mix of both. And yeah, we'll receive a chatbot case as soon as we submit our application. The timing can vary. I think in general, interview invites come out a few weeks after a given deadline. And the case bot kind of fits that timeline as well. Our timeline last year was applications were due late November for MBA applications. The online interview was like 3 or 4 weeks after that, and then the live interviews were a couple weeks after that. That extra 2 weeks in between could have been because they didn't want us to be doing interviews on Christmas Day, but yeah, I think that timeline is generally, it's within a few weeks of the application deadline. It's probably when I would start to look out for it. Is the case bot also used in UK hiring? Yeah, it's used a lot of places, different countries. Again, like that percentage I threw out, that was kind of a ballpark. It looks different in different places. It's more common in the US, I think, as they kind of piloted it here and rolled it out here, but you'll see it in other places, but maybe a little bit less commonly. is this the same thing as a one-way video interview? I am not entirely sure what a one-way video interview is. I would assume it's my assumption there is that it's you're thinking of like the online interviews that are more common these days where you're recording answers to specific things, and it's kind of like that where it's question and you respond and then you move on to the next question literally. But yeah. Any tips for passing the BCG Pymetrics test component, Meg? Yeah, we can talk about that probably separate from this session. Plenty of advice there. Not all of it is like super tactical. I think everyone has questions about that because similar to this, other firms and BCG, BCG has the Pymetrics, McKinsey has their fish habitat game and other stuff. Like they're just different, wonkier parts of the process. Those in particular, things like the Pymetrics test are harder to prep for because like in theory, they're trying to test for like your intuition and just like get a scope for like who you are and how you think about the world. It's a measure of your risk tolerance and your analytical speed and things like that, where it's like you can't really back solve. The games are things like popping balloons and like really they feel like really random. So there's not always like a ton of direct things you can do to prepare for them. But yeah, if you want to talk more about them, we can. What kind of math questions are most likely to appear from Becca? Yeah, I think, again, in a normal case, you kind of have a mix between like financy questions or things that they'll give you. They'll read you the numbers verbally and you need to do like quick calculations. In this, it skews much more towards like the chart type of math, which is more like identifying trends and being able to use various pieces of data from charts to reach a conclusion. I'd say things like side-by-side bar charts where you're multiplying different percentages to create subsets or things like that like are pretty common. But yeah, in general, the most common I'd say would be chart analysis, figuring out how to tie different pieces of data together. And then, yeah, again, there'll be probably multiple choice. And so, yeah, often they're just like computational. And can you take all of the data that we give you? We're going to give you more data than you actually need. Can you figure out which pieces of data are relevant? Figure out what the right format for multiplying them together is or whatever, and then coming up with that multiple choice. Good companies to purchase practice cases from and for preparation and practice. Leland Plus is the official plug, I think. Yeah, I think there's probably where I would start. Coaches we're also, I'm happy to talk with any of you one-on-one, as we'll talk about later. Yeah, all of the online third-party ones, there's lots of ones you can buy. I remember going through and looking and seeing practice packs for $200 for 3 cases and feeling like I wanted to do that. I didn't end up purchasing them because the advice I got from people on the BCG side was like, they're not always like the most reliable, and it's a little bit of a crapshoot. I mean, maybe it doesn't hurt, but as far as like specific other recommendations outside of that, I'm not sure. Are BCG applications reviewed on a rolling basis? That's kind of the official. More commonly, you'll hear that they are like they have specific deadlines. I know there's been a couple for undergrads in the last few months. There's the last one coming up in September. So technically they're rolling because you can apply kind of before any of those deadlines. In reality, what ends up happening is the bulk of interview invites still come out, 3 weeks after each of those deadlines. It's possible to kind of be a little bit off of that cycle. If you apply exactly halfway in between two deadlines or whatever, but most commonly it still kind of follows the deadline hits. They review everything. 3 or 4 weeks later, they send out invites. And then MBA applications are still kind of once a year set on their existing timeline. When do graduate scheme 2024 applications open for Kellogg? Looks like Amelia answered those ones well. Parker says, I'm attending a non-targeted MBA program this fall, but want to land a summer associate position. How much harder is it to get a foot in the door? Yeah, like the answer often is the case in consulting, the answer is it depends. the answer is going to be very, very different if you're at, the number 20 school versus the number 60 school versus another, more local regionalized school. It gets a little bit harder the more you go down. And again, thinking about what I said earlier about all of this being kind of a holistic process. If you're at one of those schools, maybe the other aspects of your application become more important, your ability to do well on this and your networking and your work experience, things like that. Like, again, there's 5 or 6 things that they're considering. And so there's other ways you can make up for that. But yeah, that's another one I'm happy to chat about later, Parker. Is BCG still on hiring freeze for experienced hires? It's slow. Yeah. We can talk more about that too, Megan. But yeah, for now it's been a little bit slower. Cool. As we reach the end of the questions here, keep throwing them in the chat if you have them. I'm happy to hang on for a little bit longer. 2 quick reminders from the Leland side. Make sure you sign up for Leland. That's how you'll get access to the recordings and from the week and all the other cool stuff that we're giving out. People who attended today, there's 3 sessions that I'm giving away. So make sure you're signed up for Leland so you can have access to that. And then, there's also that coupon code that you can use if you have follow-up questions. I love working with all of you and would love to chat. With the caveat of, if your questions are about my experience with BCG, why I chose BCG over other places, or if your question is about Kellogg or business school, if your questions are in either of those realms, I won't charge you for that time. So just like throw an intro call on my calendar and we can chat about my experience at BCG, why I liked it, why I chose it. And business school, I'm also always happy to chat. And we won't charge time for that because we like talking about Kellogg and business school because they're great. Cool. Yep. Let me throw my LinkedIn on here as well. I think Erica just threw my or Amelia just threw on my Leland profile. You can also scan the code there. But yeah, I know I talked very quickly in the last half hour. Very happy we were as efficient as we can. High level takeaways. If you remember nothing else from this session, I'd say the biggest things to remember are, again, it's going to feel different, but don't let that get into your head. As long as you're practicing all of the core fundamentals of the interview, being structured and analytical and practicing charts and math, all of this stuff you've been practicing is still super relevant to all of this. And all of that preparation you've done has helped you to get prepared for here. Apart from that, don't overly stress about it. As long as you have a plan, think about the logistics and go in confident, you're going to do fine. It's another case. It feels different. It's going to feel weird, but all of you are capable of doing it. And you're all going to do great. I'll hang on for the next 5 or so minutes. If people want to chat. But thank you all for coming. Great luck. You're going to do great.